After the administration of Donald Trump introduced large-scale tariffs against the European Union, relations between Washington and Brussels have been undergoing a real transformation, and this is increasingly mentioned in the confidential analytical summaries of the European Commission that end up in the hands of European journalists. According to information published by the business outlet Politico EU, citing 3 high-ranking diplomats, a new economic strategy is taking shape in the EU, which some are already calling a counterstrike against the dollar. Already today, several countries, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, have faced rising import costs from the US, and according to the Bruegel Analytical Center, Trump's tariffs may cost European business more than 150 billion euros over the next 2 years, which will inevitably trigger large-scale recessionary processes, especially in countries with worsening budget indicators. And this, according to Financial Times sources, has become the turning point in the discussion. Europe is no longer willing to be a passive player in Washington's game. For the first time in many decades, the EU has decided to use an instrument that the US has long considered untouchable: American government debt. According to insiders at the European Central Bank, starting from late summer, European countries have begun gradually but steadily reducing the volumes of US Treasury bonds they hold. Formally, this is presented as a technical reallocation operation for reserve optimization, but Bloomberg economics analysts emphasize that the synchrony of the moves and the timing directly point to the political nature of the decision. Europe is tired of paying for someone else's protectionist policy, and now Washington for the first time feels that its weak spot, the growing national debt, increasingly difficult to service due to spending and domestic social programs, is becoming an object of external pressure. At the same time, the EU is taking a second step, far more sensitive for the US. More and more contracts within the bloc and with strategic partners are now being shifted to euro settlements. This is visible in SWIFT statistics, where the share of the euro in international payments has reached its highest level since 2012, while the share of the dollar has for the first time begun to decline at a faster pace. The French newspaper Le Monde cites sources in the Ministry of Finance of France who state directly, "We cannot support a system where an ally delivers an economic blow to us. We must prepare an alternative." Germany, according to Handelsblatt, is already developing special schemes for energy purchases, without dollar settlements, in order to reduce dependence on the American currency, and Italy is discussing the creation of a unified industrial support fund to be financed exclusively in euros. A particularly alarming signal for the White House is that the Nordic countries, traditionally the most loyal to the US, have also begun privately supporting the idea of European financial autonomy. According to Der Spiegel, Denmark and Sweden were among the first to halt purchases of new issues of American bonds, arguing this with increased risks connected to US domestic political instability and Trump's attempts to rebuild the economy at the expense of allies. In Brussels, the phrase "Europe can no longer be just a market for American goods. We must be a center of power" is heard more and more often. And if earlier such statements came from individual politicians, today, the new course is discussed in the European Central Bank, in the EU Council, and even in NATO corridors. And the boldest analysts say this may become the beginning of the end of the dollar era. An internal report prepared by the research service of the European Parliament notes that the dominance of the dollar rests not only on the economy, but also on trust. And now it is trust that is being undermined by the actions of the Trump administration itself: repeated tariff pressure, threats to exit key trade agreements, attempts to force allies to buy American industrial products through blackmail, and diplomatic pressure. Europe is responding in kind, but far more strategically, by reducing its investments in US debt and eroding the dollar's control over global trade. And what makes this especially painful for Washington is that it's not China, not Russia, and not even the BRICS countries doing it, but the US's closest ally of the past 80 years. Analysts at Bank of America warn in a confidential note to clients that if the EU completes its financial restructuring and continues offloading US debt at the current pace, the US will face an unprecedented rise in Treasury yields, which will increase the cost of servicing its enormous debt, already more than $36 trillion. and create the threat of a budgetary crisis. US media remain cautious in their wording, but the Wall Street Journal has already acknowledged that Europe no longer wants to be an object. It seeks to become a subject, noting that what began as a local dispute over tariffs on steel and automobiles is turning into a systemic conflict of models, protectionism versus autonomy. And according to CNN, Trump's advisors are discussing the possibility of retaliatory measures against the EU financial sector, fearing that if the trend continues, the US economy will lose a key lever of global influence, the ability to print the world's reserve currency without consequences. Insiders at the European Commission claim this is only the beginning. Initiatives are already being developed to create a pan-European energy market outside the dollar zone, industrial stimulus programs based on euro financing, and an expansion of direct economic ties with Asia and the Middle East without US involvement. What only recently seemed unthinkable is now discussed as inevitability. The world is entering an era in which America's financial monopoly is no longer an axiom. The EU is not declaring war. It is simply refusing to play by someone else's rules. And now, it is the US that is forced to react to the agenda set by Europe. A continent tired of enduring blows from an ally has become a subject of a new financial era. And according to analysts at Oxford Economics, we will see the consequences very soon, when the dollar stops being the only instrument through which one can dictate terms to the whole world. This is not the collapse of an alliance, not a rupture of ties. It is a redistribution of power. And it seems that Europe has only just begun its path. And what is most notable, according to experts from the International Monetary Fund, is that Europe is acting quietly, without loud press releases or threats, as if performing a surgical operation to reshape the global financial architecture. And Washington has already begun to understand that the situation is slipping out of control. A leak published by Associated Press claims that during closed-door discussions in the White House, someone said, "We are for the first time seeing our closest ally form a front against the dollar." And if a year ago such a statement would have been considered an exaggeration, now it sounds like a cold reality in which America is no longer protected by the status of the world's financial center, and Europe is no longer willing to pay for US privileges. An internal report from the US Treasury already warns that if the debt sell-off continues at this pace, and euro-based settlements fully consolidate in major sectors, the Trump administration will face a dilemma: either cancel the tariffs to stop capital flight, or risk encountering the most dangerous threat any empire can face: the loss of trust in its money.